The first thing we have, this is something new. We've discussed fairly often, and we haven't done this, but setting up some core beliefs so that everybody kind of knows what it's about, what kind of binds us together, I think. So I'm just going to read this. It's called Dedication to Liberty. First, we come together today to assert and affirm our beliefs. We believe that every individual owns his or her own life and property. We believe that ownership is complete and unconditional. We believe that no person or persons are ever justified in using aggression to violate that ownership. We believe a world without involuntary taxation is possible. We believe that such a world would be preferable and is, in fact, necessary for our continued existence as a species. We hereby commit ourselves to work by whatever means necessary to bring about such a world. This is a sort of a trial, and feedback on this, too, would be good. I think this is kind of intended as something analogous to something you'd see in a church, and just to explain that, this is based on the model of a church. It's not exactly intended to be spiritual in nature, but or religious in nature, but this is kind of analogous to something that people would say in unison in church, affirming their beliefs, and that might be something that we want to do it that way, where everybody kind of says it together, if they want to, or if they don't. But I think, just throw that out there for now, and let everybody chew on that. I think for Justin.
All right, today I'm going to explain the topic of public goods and start out with, what do Barack Obama, Neil deGrasse Tyson, the scientist guy, and Elizabeth Warren all have in common? They all have a misunderstanding of public goods, and have all made the argument in the past that there are some goods and services that only the government can provide, right? You didn't build that. Only the government can provide space exploration and stuff like that, right? So this topic is important because, as we just affirmed in our dedication to liberty, that we believe that a world is possible without involuntary taxation, which was the prerequisite to fund these public goods. So this is important because I've noticed, and it's a real pet peeve of mine, that many people misunderstand and misidentify what public goods are. My skin just crawls when I hear something like, education is a public good. That is totally incorrect from a definitional standpoint. So what people are doing when they say something like that is they're misusing the word public good when they mean positive externality. So an externality is when there is a side effect that does not happen between the people in the direct exchange. So a negative externality is pollution, right? If a factory makes a widget and the person buying the widget gets the benefit, but a third party who was not privy to that transaction receives the pollution, that's a negative externality. And a positive externality could be something like education, where arguably society is better off if other people are more educated. You know, someone else might pay for that $50,000 a year Harvard education or something like that. I don't know what it costs to go to Harvard, maybe more than that. but you get the point. But arguably other people benefit from that. So that's what an externality is, and that's what people are trying to often say when they talk about public goods, but that is definitionally incorrect. So that's what a public good is not. A public good is not a positive externality, because here's what the real definition of a public good are. So there's 4 types of goods. I've put up on the board here a quadrant, and there's 2 defining characteristics. There's rivalry and excludability. So rivalry means that if you consume it, there is less of that thing to consume by someone else. And excludability means you can keep other people out from consuming that item. So my coffee is a private good because it is excludable and rivalrous. I just drank it, so obviously that it's gone, and it's excludable. It was in my cup, separate from all the rest of the coffee in the world. So that's private goods. That's what we often talk about in economic transactions. And things get a little more interesting when you get into the other 3 categories. A club good is something that is excludable but non-rivalrous. An example of this would be like a movie in a movie theater. If we're sitting next to each other, if a third person comes and sits and watches the movie, they're not detracting from the amount of viewers that can watch the movie. But as you notice in the theater, that it's walled. They charge people admission to enter, and so this makes it a club good. So the cost is bore by the people who join to participate, right? So there's some other examples of club goods. Obviously anything that has pretty much a club name in it, like a golf resort or something like that, a golf course, if it's a club membership. As long as it's below peak traffic, roads are a club good if you're on say a tollway or something like that. So anyways, the next area is the commons. This is something like grass in the field or a park, or fish in the ocean, oil, minerals in the ground that is on public property. This is because the resource is rivalrous. It is limited in scope or amount. Oh, hey. Yeah, welcome. Sure.
Hi, Franji. There you go. I got a program for you. And we're recording here, so if you want to sit in this chair together.
So common goods are rivalrous. They can be consumed and depleted, but they are not excludable, right? So fish in the ocean is an example. You can't stop other people from fishing, or it's difficult to, but the fish in the sea are fairly limited. And then the last area is a public good. A public good is something that is non-excludable and non-rivalrous. A great example of this is fireworks. If we both watch fireworks, we don't reduce the amount of fireworks that can be seen by other people, and we also can't keep out other people, prevent them from watching it. So this is what people try to argue, that only the government can provide, is this category of public goods, because you come across what's called the free rider problem, where everyone wants someone else to pay, but everyone else wants to benefit. Well, in theory, that sounds nice, and there are some, but interestingly in practice, this is often very different. One of the most commonly used textbook examples when you take an econ class is the lighthouse. So in a lighthouse would meet the criteria of a public good. Using the lighthouse doesn't detract from it. It doesn't deplete it, and you can't prevent other people from using the lighthouse. But historically, lighthouses have often been provided privately. So Ronald Coase is a Nobel-winning economist, just passed away recently. He used this as an example that is a critique of what he called blackboard economics, where targeting Paul Samuelson, who came up with this theory of public goods, was saying, well, that's nice in theory, but you actually need to look at how your examples worked in practice, and you find there are actually private solutions to these problems. So how can we voluntarily provide public goods? There are actually quite a few ways. And this is where it gets interesting, that the market solves these problems, even if theoretically you argue that only the government can. So the first thing that comes to mind in our age is Wikipedia. In theory, Wikipedia should not exist, right? It's a public good. It should not exist without taxpayer dollars. You can use it for free. Using it doesn't deplete the source, and you can't prevent other people from using it as long as they have the internet. But lo and behold, the Wikipedia is people voluntarily, without compensation, contribute and edit the content, which is amazing. So obviously there are behaviors that are separate from what Homo economicus would do. People are, whether it's ideology or passionate about something, people are willing to do something for free that other people benefit from. Another way you can overcome the public goods problem is assurance contracts, where if, let's say we were all going to build something like a lighthouse, right, and we all live in the area, we might say, well, as long as everyone agrees to, pitch in 10%, then we'll agree to it. And so this is something like Kickstarter, right? Kickstarter is a private company or whatever that uses this fundraising technique where if you reach a threshold, then everyone will get to contribute. And so that's called an assurance contract. So Kickstarter is a way to get over the public goods problem. You have something called privileged groups, which might sound weird, but what it means is that there are people who benefit, but the provider of this public good receives more benefit than the cost of which it costs to provide that. So an example is, I think it's really funny, if you use like the parking lots of your major stores are always better maintained than public streets. So people who argue only the government can build the roads, but if you look at the pavement, or even, so the point is that the companies benefit by their customers being able to come to their business, and they will fork over that, even if not every person who drives on that road is a customer. And so this is called the privileged group, where non-customers who happen to be using the road are benefiting, even though customers are the ones who are indirectly paying for it. So that happens a lot. Another is you can create an exclusion mechanism, which would turn a public good into a club good. So some common examples of this are like paywalls for internet websites, or cable companies scrambling their signal to make it so that not everyone can use it. And then this way they can draw revenue from it. So this can happen privately. And the last thing is that even if in theory, in Blackboard economics, you could say that only the government can do this, in which we showed that most of the time that's not true, then in practice, you have to look at, well, what does government do? And even on its best days, it also suffers from public choice problems. So you have, if you're criticizing market failure, you need to acknowledge government failure and realize that, okay, maybe the market might fail in this situation because there are not the incentives to produce this thing, but that doesn't mean the government can do better. So that's the theory of public goods and how we as voluntary a society would provide those things. And there's many different ways, and it just depends on which situation would be the best one. So the main thing I want people to understand is that education is not a public good. It doesn't mean an externality. It's actually a specific condition, and even in that specific condition, there are private ways which it can be provided. Thanks.
Hey Gavin, can you turn that heater up a little bit? It's on full blast. Do you want to announce Bruce?
Is it Bruce next?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, next up we'll have Bruce Majors reading Mending Wall.
Bruce, can you connect that to me?
So it's a Robert Frost poem. I'm not sure, but I think maybe the overall idea is that good fences make good neighbors, but we'll see. Hey, someone's going to explain it later. The Mending Wall by Robert Frost. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it, and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair where they have left not one stone on a stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps, I mean, no one has made them or heard them made, but at spring mending time we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go. To each the boulders that have fallen to each, and some are loaves and some are nearly balls. We have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to little more. There where it is, we do not need the wall. Here is all pine and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines. I tell him, he only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there, bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only and the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well. He says again, good fences make good neighbors. I can't see how to get this off.
Okay, thanks Bruce for reading that poem. I had asked Bruce to read that poem because I thought it would be sort of a good launching pad for the topic of my sermon today, which is all about boundaries and how important they are for life. Before I get into the main part of my sermon, I just want to touch on a couple things about this poem. I really liked this when I was younger. I still do. But I found myself when I was younger identifying a lot with, mostly with the main character with Robert Frost's voice. But as my thoughts have developed and I've matured, I find myself more and more identifying with the neighbor in the poem. And just a couple things I want to draw out to give explanation for that. You notice that the Robert Frost character in this poem is sort of dismissive towards his neighbor. He has this attitude that basically says, you know, he hasn't thought about this saying of his father that good fences make good neighbors. He just repeats it mindlessly. And he even says at one point or implies that his neighbor is a savage with the attitude he's taking. And I think that gives the neighbor short shrift. I think that it's possible the neighbor has actually thought about this saying that good fences make good neighbors and agrees with it. That's why he repeats it. So that's the first thing I want to draw out. The second thing I want to draw out is Robert Frost makes a very odd statement that I would characterize as immature in this poem. You notice he says, if I was going to build a wall, I'd want to know what I was keeping in and what I was keeping out. And that's fine. But then he says, and to whom I might give offense. And what he's implying by that statement is that he has grounds, he has basis to take offense because his neighbor wants to maintain his wall. He's also implying that people have a basis to be offended if somebody wants to do something that you don't want with their property. But that's not the case. You don't have any basis to be offended if somebody does something that you don't like with their property. That's implying that you have some sort of claim on their property, which you don't. So I think that's an immature statement. The last thing I want to point out about this poem is the statement that he starts with and repeats in the poem, which is, something there is that doesn't love a wall and wants it to come down. I think that's a sentiment that every one of us can identify with. On some level, we all want to live in a boundless world where there's no resistance, where no one asserts their boundaries. But it's important to recognize that boundaries are important. In fact, it's important to recognize that boundaries are essential to life. So that's the main topic of my talk today, and that's what I want to talk about now. The title of my talk is The Boundaries, the Sine Qua Non of Life. And I don't know if it was a good idea to put Latin in the title, but if you don't know what sine qua non is, it just basically means without that not. So, but you need boundaries for life is the point. So as I was preparing this, I was thinking, how could I make this case? And I thought the first step would be to define life. And this is not as easy as it seems, to define the essence of what makes living things different from non-living things. It's a very slippery concept, in fact. I don't know if you've ever thought about it or if you've ever even looked up in the dictionary the definition of life. What you start doing is you start coming up with characteristics of life. Like living things grow, they replicate, they adapt. And these are all characteristics, but I don't know if it gets to the essence of life. How are living things different from non-living things? So to shed some light on this question, I wanted to share with you an anecdote from my own life. When I was about 12 years old, I had a very curious conversation with my father. I had learned something in class that day about cell biology. And if you don't remember your cell biology, there is a gradient that all of the cells in your bodies maintain, a chemical gradient, along their cell membranes. So you have a boundary here, just like in the poem, there's the wall is a boundary. And the way that this works is your cell, there's this thing called the sodium-potassium pump, and your cell pumps potassium into the cell, and it pumps sodium out of the cell. And the cells in your body use a tremendous amount of energy to maintain this chemical gradient. And they do this for a reason, because having a gradient on both sides of that boundary allows them to very easily transport things in and out of the cell. If they want to bring in glucose or proteins, they have a gradient that the molecule can run down, and it's the same way going out if they want to expel something. Anyway, I learned this in class, and I was talking to my dad about it, and he made the very curious statement that this is the purpose of life. And I didn't understand that then. I thought that was such an odd thing to say. And for the longest time, I didn't understand that for many years until I was in my mid-20s and I started thinking about these things from more of a conceptual level. And I realized my dad was not saying the purpose of life is for your cells to maintain a chemical gradient. He was getting more to this question about the essence of life, what makes life different from non-living things. And basically what he's trying to get to, and the definition I've come up with for life, which is not good, I think, but it's as close as I could come, is that life is the process by which material forms use energy to maintain order and build complexity. So life is when material forms use energy to maintain order and build complexity. And if you need evidence of that, find the most complex thing in the universe and see if it's living. I would argue the most complex thing in the universe is the human body or other animals. I mean, it's absurdly complex. There's nothing like it in the known universe. The universe, so the non-living universe that we know, it consists of unbelievable distances in unfathomable size, huge agglomerations of matter and energy. But it's very simple. It follows a couple simple rules. There's no complexity there. So I would even say that a single cell in our bodies is more complex than all of the non-living universe that we know of. It is often said about life that life is the only system in the universe that is able to defy the second law of thermodynamics. And if you don't remember the second law of thermodynamics, the second law of thermodynamics basically says order degrades. Entropy increases in any system, any closed system. Things break apart. Complexity becomes more simple. But when you look at life, it's the opposite. When you look at life, you see order being maintained. When you look at life, you see complexity being built. So how does life defy the second law of thermodynamics? Well, it doesn't really defy the second law of thermodynamics. It's just the second law of thermodynamics exists only within a certain condition. The condition is the second law of thermodynamics, that entropy increases, only exists where energy in the system is neutral, where there's no increase of energy. But life is the process by which material things use energy to maintain order and build complexity. So we need energy for life. We consume energy. If there was no energy, then there wouldn't be life. Now you might think, well, what do you mean when you say build complexity, maintain order? Well, it's all about building boundaries and maintaining order along those boundaries. Boundaries are essential to life. And to make this case, I want you to try to imagine the first living things, as according to the current theory of how life started on Earth. Go back 4.5 billion years ago when the Earth was just came into existence. And geologists tell us that that environment was very toxic. There was a lot of nitric acid, and it wouldn't be livable if it was the same now. But at that point, it enabled all these more complex sort of organic molecules to form. It wasn't life, but there were organic molecules like amino acids, chains of carbon, and they've actually replicated this in the laboratory. They've been able to create amino acids from nothing. And this went on for hundreds of millions of years. This thing just stewed. And then at some point, something happened where, just by chance, certain molecules started catalyzing each other. So molecule A, just by chance, catalyzes molecule B. And molecule B catalyzes molecule C. And molecule C catalyzes molecule A. So there's a chain. And even though they're not living, they're not conscious, each molecule has an interest in the well-being of the others because it created it. So there's sort of a self-interest, even though, like I said, it's not conscious. And this went on for hundreds of millions of years. They kept catalyzing each other. And then at some point, they tell us that some of these groups of molecules went into or fell into, or somehow by chance went into some sort of droplet of water or oil or lipid molecule and created a boundary. Or maybe one of the chemical compounds actually catalyzed these boundaries. Now, I would argue this is where life began, because now you have the organism is contained in a boundary. You don't really have life before that. You just have organic molecules. But now I think you could say this is when life really began. And it began because there was a boundary around it. There's a space where it says where the organism existed in space, and it was separate from the chaotic world around it. Now, before I go on, I just want to stop and talk for a second about this boundary. So you imagine this primitive cell, it's got a boundary. what are some of the things, what are the characteristics of this boundary that must exist for life to continue? And the reason I'm going to try and draw out some principles is because they apply to all boundaries in life. Okay, so the first thing is the boundary around this primitive cell, it has to be total. It has to be 100%. You can't have a 90% coverage and then 10% gap. That would not work because everything would flush out of it and it would die very quickly. So the boundary has to be total. Second thing, the boundary has to be permanent. It can't just be, the cell constructs this boundary for a week and then it turns it off and doesn't have it. It would die. So the boundary has to be total. It has to be permanent. The third characteristic is the boundary has to be regulated very closely by the organism. The beautiful thing about a boundary is that it gives the organism the ability to select when to go out into the chaotic world and bring something in. It doesn't always have to. It's protected. So it has to make the determination when it's going to selectively open the boundary. That determination cannot be made by things outside of it. If it does, then the organism would die. And the last characteristic of this boundary around this primitive cell is it has to realize that any violation of that boundary is an existential threat. It has to realize that if there's trauma to the boundary, its number one priority has to be to repair it. So these four characteristics I want to just take forward as we continue to talk about boundaries. So let's go back to that original cell. Well, they hundreds of millions of years that went by and it replicated, and then evolution kept selecting those things that worked, and on and on. Energy kept being poured into the system. Then maybe 1 billion years go by, 2 billion years, a long time, and then just by chance, some of these first cells start working together. There's some attribute that they say like, we can help each other. It's not like they decide this, it's just that some mutation that worked. Evolution chooses those. And they keep working closely. Evolution keeps choosing them until eventually at some point they build a boundary around themselves. Now you have a new life form. Before you didn't have, it wasn't considered a new life form, but when a boundary is built, then now it is considered a new life form. So you have the first multicellular life. And then fast forward through evolution, another 1 billion years go by or something, and then we're where we are today. And if you look at our bodies, they are boundaries within boundaries within boundaries. We're like a living Matryoshka doll. Those Russian dolls that you have one form, you take it apart, there's another one, take it apart. That's, So just quickly, let me go through some of the boundaries. You have skin, that's a boundary between you and the external world, obviously, but there's a boundary also in your respiratory system between the air you breathe and the blood that selectively chooses which of those molecules it's going to use. There's a boundary between your digestive system and what your body selectively chooses to pull out of the food that you eat. So all of these are external boundaries, right? And they all follow the same characteristics. They have to be total. If you can't imagine having 90% skin coverage. If you took 10% of your skin off, you would die pretty quickly. So it has to be total, has to be permanent. You have to be the organism has to regulate it. So it's not like somebody else or some other entity out there can say what molecules your bloodstream pulls out of the air. It has to be you. And the last thing is the existential threat. If there's trauma, if something falls on you and it cuts your arm, you have to make that a priority in fixing it. It could kill you very quickly. And so there are not just boundaries externally in our body. There are boundaries all throughout our boundary. There are boundaries around our organs, the circulatory system, lymphatic system, your pancreas, your brain. All these things have their own separate boundaries. There are boundaries around your cells, which we've already talked about. There are boundaries inside of your cell, your mitochondria, your nucleus. They all have boundaries, and all of these boundaries follow those same four principles. If they didn't, that thing would not function properly. Now, I've been talking mostly so far only about physical boundaries, and the reason I did that is because I wanted you to have a good metaphor as I start talking about other boundaries in life. As human beings, as social animals, we and other social animals construct other types of boundaries, non-visible boundaries. But it's important to recognize these boundaries are just the same, follow all the same characteristics of the boundaries around physical life. And the process, I would argue, of maturation from infancy to adulthood is the process by which each of us begins to recognize where those boundaries exist and understand why they're important and respect them and obey them and follow them. So just to make the case, an infant, they say at just 2 weeks old, smiles at the parent. And this is a big step, a developmental step. Psychologists tell us that the reason that this happens is because the infant has now finally recognized that this face that appears in front of it several times a day is actually a different being from itself. Previously, it had thought its ego or its mind was all that exists in the universe. Now it sees there's something separate, recognizes a non-visible boundary. As a child grows, it continues to discover these boundaries. As a toddler, it tries to hit its brother. And the parent, what happens? The parent says, you can't do that. And the child doesn't like this necessarily because he wants to hit his brother. But he's being informed about these non-visible boundaries that exist. This personal boundary exists around people. You don't hit people. And he doesn't like it because there's something that doesn't love a wall and wants it to come down. There's something that doesn't like boundaries. But as he matures, he begins to realize, I don't like people hitting me. I don't want to hit them, or I shouldn't be hitting them. And several years goes by, and then the same child, he's discovered reading his sister's diary. And he's told, you can't read your sister's diary. And this is not something he likes to hear again. It's the same principle. But he's told, you have to respect people's privacy. We put these boundaries around things that we want private for a purpose. And as the child continues to grow, he starts to realize that yes, you do. I want to have privacy, so I have to respect privacy. This process continues. And then as an adolescent, maybe the child starts having relationships, and now he learns about emotional boundaries. Starts realizing he needs to recognize where his emotional boundaries are. The other people are, it's not an easy process to recognize that there are people who build emotional boundaries, but it's important, it's necessary. So all of these things, personal boundaries, privacy boundaries, emotional boundaries, all of these things, you cannot imagine an adult existing without having boundaries and without recognizing other people's boundaries. Life wouldn't work. And you try to imagine somebody who doesn't have total emotional boundaries, who has 90% coverage of emotional boundaries. Like that's an invalid. That's a person that can't exist in our world. And these boundaries have to be regulated by the person. So they have to be, the organism decides, or you decide, or the person decides when they're going to lower these boundaries, or when, selectively lower these boundaries. And it's an existential threat. If someone hurts you emotionally, you react like this is a matter of life and death. It is a matter of life and death. And you take steps to repair that damage, and you take steps to avoid it in the future. So all of these boundaries, even though they're non-visible, they follow the same rules as physical boundaries in life. And unfortunately, there is a last type of boundary which most people do not have very clearly. See, most people, if you talk about personal boundaries, privacy boundaries, emotional boundaries, I'd say 95% of the world's population, adults, would be like, yeah, you have to respect those. But when it comes to property boundaries, there's a question. And people have not been, I would say, socialized properly to recognize property boundaries. That's why I think people, us in the church praxeology, other people in the liberty movement, we really are on a higher stage of development as adult human beings. We really are, and I think that's how we should see ourselves. 95% of the world's population, more probably, 99% of the world's population does not see the importance of property boundaries, does not recognize all of the same characteristics go for property boundaries. They have to be total, 100%. They have to be permanent. They have to be regulated only by the person who's established the boundary. And if there's a trauma that occurs to that boundary, it's an existential threat. And it needs to be repaired. It needs to be reasserted. So we're at a very difficult, curious point in our history. I mean, all periods in history are interesting, But this question of property boundaries is going to come to the foreground, and it's going to be something that is going to be very contentious. It already is, but things are moving in the world in a way that they haven't before. And I believe there will be some sort of crisis, but the point is, we have a choice as a species, one way or another. The choice is, either we can say there are property boundaries, they're absolute, they have to be respected 100%, or we say they don't exist, or we just say that there's no such thing as properties. And people do say this. 100 years ago, the communists had a phrase, I don't know if they still use it, property is theft. Property is theft, that's what they said, Now, if we let people take that attitude, we're going to have tyranny. And you think about, what's a tyrant? A tyrant is an emotional infant. A tyrant is there's something in life that doesn't love a wall and wants it to come down, taken to its logical extreme. A tyrant wants no boundaries. He doesn't want you to have privacy. He doesn't want you to have any kind of emotional relationships with anyone that's not mediated by him. He doesn't want you to have property for sure. He doesn't even want you to have your own thoughts. So if we start compromising on this principle of boundaries just because they're non-visible, we're going to create an absolute tyranny. And what really gets me, beyond the fact that there will be no life in a real sense in that world, it's when you read about these stories about like Soviet, the totalitarian or North Korea or something, it's how boring that world is. People have no distance between themselves. There's no mystery, there's no wonder in that world. It's just, you're just biological matter. No other boundary exists. And so, it really, it's just such a sad world. So that's one direction we can go. The other direction we can go is where we want to take it with the church, why we're doing this with the church, which is to get everyone to accept the property boundaries have to be 100%. They have to be permanent. They have to be regulated only by the person who sets them up. And any threat has to be responded to. Now, let me just give you a couple ideas about what this world would look like. Hopefully every service there'll be we can offer some sort of vision about this. First thing about this world where property boundaries are absolute, I think, is that people will be so much more mature. A 12-year-old in that world will be far more mature than most people are today. Because the rules about property are actually very simple. A 12-year-old can understand them. If somebody else owns it, they do whatever they want. It's not some huge complex science here. It's actually a very simple regulating principle. And a 12-year-old learns about personal boundaries, privacy boundaries, emotional boundaries, and then boom, property boundaries. Okay, you're ready for the world, And he goes out and spends the rest of his life on productive work. And there's none of this resentment towards the world. There's none of this resentment towards other people. There's none of this. See, right now how it exists, boundaries are so slippery. Nobody knows. How is it that I'm told that I can go make a decision about somebody who lives in Maine, 1,000 miles away? That's just absurd. I have nothing to do with that person, but I'm told somehow I should be able to make a choice about how he lives his life. It doesn't make any sense. And so that person gets resentful. I get resentful, and there's resentment everywhere when you have politics, but it doesn't have to be like that. And it wouldn't be like that in the future, because it would just be, yeah, it's your property, you do whatever you want. So there would be a lot more life. And, the other thing I like to think about is just there would be wonder in that world. There would be mystery in that world. When you have really strong boundaries between people, everyone is so secure in their own boundaries. Whether they don't own a lot, but it's like they're very secure. And there's this sense of space between people, And from that sense of space comes a wonder about other people. And a real interest. Since I'm so secure, my boundaries are not shelters necessarily. Now I'm looking outwards. And what do I want? I want to be intimate with other people. And the only way I can do that in that world is to merit it, to merit the esteem that people will say, okay, now I'm selectively going to lower my boundary. So what I think you're going to see in that world is arms race of merit, where people are really trying to earn esteem. And it's a beautiful idea. And the inverse applies, of course, to people who don't respect boundaries or who don't deserve that world is tiny for them because these boundaries just shoot up and surround them, and they can't go anywhere. So I hope I've made the case that boundaries are important to life, and that, you know, this sentiment, there's something in life that doesn't love a wall and wants it to come down. I hope that we all, as members of the church, don't let that run free. We understand it, but we hold it on a very tight leash, because we immediately respond to that yes, there's something that doesn't love a wall, but without boundaries, we don't have life anyway. So with that, I guess just want to thank everyone for coming, and I wanted to thank Bruce. If you guys don't know, Bruce is a real estate agent, and so you know, if you ever consider buying a property, talk to him. Or selling one too. The idea of the church is we all help each other out, you know, and so, because if everyone, you know, if you have a value, if somebody else, Bruce has similar values to you, you can fight for your values, or you can help him do well, and then your values succeed in the world. So also I wanted to announce that I'm going to have another open house. I do this after every service at my condo in DuPont. Usually it's on Wednesday. Tomorrow it's going to be on Tuesday because I'm going out of town. So the idea here, if you're new and you want to come, like, you know, we don't have to talk about the church. We could just hang out, or we could talk about church, talk about liberty in general, what we're trying to do here. I'm not going to have anything prepared, so just snacks and drinks. But anytime from 7 to 11, come for an hour, come for the whole time. I'll put my address up on the Facebook page. And does anyone have any questions or thoughts before we adjourn?
Yeah, I think I just trying to connect what you guys said, and which is beautiful. I mean, I just think that if you submit your private boundary to the public, what you said, you're pretty much letting it will be abused, and that's pretty much what I believe. I mean, I'm glad I'm here. Thank you for having me here. I thought I was alone in this world until I met all of you. Finally, I feel people understand me. But yeah, I basically agree with everything what was said down over here. That's what I said. Private boundary is what I believe in, and I'm not willing to submit it to the public in order for it to be abused, because that's what happens when we submit it. And if we submit it, it's going to be, you know, it's a fact. That's what happens, and that's what, unfortunately, the marketing of the machine of the public. You know, I know you said that was it Warren, Tyson,
Warren,
and the president. I would actually throw in the Republican Party, because I see the
they talk about national defense as a public good.
Yeah, I'm just saying, you know, I think that it's a duopoly over there, and they're also infringing on my private, you know, their good marketing is saying that they're for private boundary, but they don't. They don't.
No.
And the whole point of when I see this church, I see the ideas over here, and I say, I'm hopeful. I just think that marketing it wise, I think that I can help with that, and I have some ideas, and you know, it's like any business or any idea that you come up with technology, and you're saying, and you're like, I think this could go. I believe that this is going to be the way of the future. Every young person, everybody deep down believe in privacy and private boundary, like you said. I just feel that there's some fear that stops them, or the marketing of a machine. Like the Democratic Party uses the words progressive, liberal. I believe that we're the true liberals, and I feel that they stole that away from us. And people, like young people around the world, poor people, they're seeing that, and they're saying they will provide me what I need, as opposed to what we are actually want to provide them more, to have control of their own privacy. And that's what I think that we should play on in the future, marketing this great idea that we have.
Yeah, I mean, the church, we're just getting started, as Gavin said, and you know, we have just been pretty much playing to ourselves,
No,
and because we want to have a good product before we really start marketing it, you know. And this is our 8th service. We do them once a month. The idea is to start doing them more frequently this summer, but we really want input. So I mean, yes, we want anyone who wants to be involved. It's definitely, you know, any idea is welcome, and so that's, you know, it's great to have you here. And
I think the product is here.
Yeah.
I just think that, I mean, we have the product. I mean, I think that I'm listening to all you guys, and I'm saying, Friday's here.
Mhm.
I just think, definitely I would love to give my input as far as getting more people in it.
Great.
There was, when you were talking about the fact that boundaries were required for life and violations of those boundaries were, the first priority was to recreate that boundary if that boundary was injured.
Right.
I was thinking about a trip we did a few years ago down to the Natural Bridge. There's a Native American tribe, and they have speakers who talk about life back at that time. But what they talked about was a stockade, and the fact that you never left the stockade unless you were part of an armed party. And that stockade was your life. You had to defend it at all costs, because if it was breached, that's basically be destroyed by your neighbor
Mm-hmm.
down the road. But it seemed very much like the cellular type structure. This just this round stockade that you had to live in unless you were armed when you went outside.
Definitely.
Another analogy, I
Yeah.
guess.
Tying our talks together, I'm sure you guys have heard the phrase "the tragedy of the commons," which happens when people overuse a commonly owned good, which means no one owns it. There was, as people started to realize that in England, like hundreds of years ago, there was this problem of overgrazing in the pastures. And so there was something called the enclosure movement to create boundaries so that people would have a place that was theirs, that they would have their cattle or sheep or whatever. And you wouldn't have this overgrazing problem that would happen. So creating boundaries can move it to either a private good if it's a commons, or a club good if it's public good. And that creates, property and everything.
And I guess, I'm sure you know much more about Ellen Nordstrom than I do, but she talks about that. And I guess, does she talk about rules that maybe still in the commons, but they're just rules about how people share the commons? So their boundaries are more sort of legalistic, perhaps.
In small groups, whether it's like villages or something where people have shared values, you have some commons can be maintained. It's kind of like Wikipedia, where it's like people do it. The Blackboard economics model would say this shouldn't happen. People should. You have free rider problems or overgrazing or whatever. But because they do have a collective shared interest and they are concerned about the well-being of everyone, they do maintain those resources carefully. So in small groups where you have that association, and you can overcome that as well, as what the person said. And when you bring in a larger government where, like you said, you don't know people in Maine, what your interests are going to be directly at conflict, it's only those people you know more closely and can care about can make those kinds of decisions. So that was some of her insights.
Okay. Well, we're gonna go for brunch like we do usually, so everyone's invited. And yeah. Well, that's up to you, Bruce, since this is your neighborhood. Pranav, you probably know someplace around here, right?
Yeah, it's not outside my neighborhood, but I'm on my bike, so I think any place that's close. We're close to H Street, right?
We walked down to 8th Street, I bet you came in right under an hour. So.
Or someplace closer to